impact-weighted accounts. And I am Maddie. I'm a researcher with Socious. I would also like to welcome Sarah, who is the founder and CEO of Socious. Hi, Sarah. Joining us today, we have two very special guests. We are going to jump right into conversation to continue the last two conversations about the latest and practical applications of IWA. Before that, let me briefly introduce Socious and where the context of this conversation is coming from. Some of you may already know that Socious is a talent marketplace. We work to pair impact-driven organizations with individuals who are keen to make a positive social and environmental impact in the world. This, of course, has become more and more prevalent, and people are more aware of the impacts that our companies and organizations are making in the last couple of decades in particular. When we look at, of course, the fact that the global population living in extreme poverty has significantly declined with all of our technological advancements in the last 100+ years. That, of course, is good. And yet, because of the growth rate of population and so many other factors, we are facing increasing challenges in terms of our environmental wellness, the social welfare of our society, and also just how products are managed, consumed, and dealt with in society. So within that conversation, we have brought first Ms. Nozomi Witherspoon to talk with us from the Japan Research Institute. Ms. Nozomi Witherspoon is a sustainability and social impact senior specialist at the Japan Research Institute, but she is also board director of Creatella Impact and the former executive director of Leap Philanthropy, which is a Singapore-based impact investment and venture philanthropy fund aimed at alleviating poverty in Southeast Asia. So with 18 years and more of experience across agricultural business, financial inclusion, and the water and energy sectors, she brings critical business acumen to the fields of international development and social impact. Welcome, Nozomi.
So cool. Great. Well, thank you so much. And hi, good morning, good evening, everywhere around the world. I don't know where everybody's based in, but it's really great to communicate. One way, but communicate. Thank you so much. So thanks, Maddie, for the kind introduction. So I'm going to quickly dive into just share for the kick off my perspective to so that we can get it to the discussion. So I hope you can see my screen. Do you see my screen? Yep. And how do I slideshow? Yeah. Okay. Is this clear? Yep. Okay. Thank you so much. So I'm going to spend next quickly 5 to maybe 7 minutes or so just to share where I am coming from and what I can contribute for the further discussions to come. So where I'm coming from. So as Maddie briefly explained, but I wanted to step a little bit more back because I strongly believe that for this type of work that we do, it's very important that we all feel the passion in it because it's not a huge money-making business. So therefore, where the passions comes from. So just to share on that part. So my background is, here it goes. This is my history. So as you can see, I am Japanese. I'm currently based in Japan, but I actually spent more of my life outside of Japan. Started from the Iraq, Baghdad as a kindergarten, Tanzania, Dar es Salaam for 7-8 years as elementaries and junior high. And in a way, this Tanzania, Dar es Salaam part, this really formed who I am and why I'm doing the work that I'm doing today. Basically, as being a Japanese family living in Tanzania, this is about 30 years ago, the poverty and income gaps was obvious. And as a kid, I had to wonder, like, where's this difference coming from? And that's really became my North Star of my my interest into driving ESG and business as force for good. It's really becoming the core North Star from here. And after the Dar es Salaam, the high school and undergrad, I was in Japan, Tokyo. After that, basically as my first job, I took, sorry, there's a master's program in between. I did the master's program in International Sustainable Development in Boston. And after Boston, my first job was at the World Bank based in Washington, D.C., where I worked as financial sector specialist in Africa region. Later moved on to San Francisco, a US-based NGO, which supports the water and microfinance. And then just a little bit quickly forward, because of the lack of time, I think these two are the key ones that I think we're going to discuss today. After my experience at the World Bank and the NGO, as a family, we moved to Singapore, and where I spent about 7 years. In Singapore, I worked as an executive director for the Impact Investment Fund. It's called the Leap Philanthropy, and which the model I can share a little bit later. And then it's just really last year. It's been only a year that I came back. I'm now back in Japan, in Tokyo, working as the Japan Research Institute. Basically, this is a think and do tank. So think and do tank specifically working towards sustainability and social impact matters for working with both corporate and government and also NGO. Where this maybe Maddie, that we can discuss a little bit later too, but in a nutshell, this impact investment funds, Deep Philanthropy, this one we worked to support the social businesses in Southeast Asia, which includes Cambodia, Indonesia, and Myanmar. And we provided the debt funding to the social business. And how we find those business, how do we do the due diligence, how do we cultivate the pipelines of business? I think that's where this impact-weighted accounting, as well as other measurements for the, how do you measure the company doing the good? That's where it comes from. So that's that part. Just a little bit moving on, where my current work is heading towards in this context of how do we measure the company and why do we measure the company? I think this is my core questions that key questions that I've been discovering for the last few years. And I really do think that the world is moving beyond only ESG, which obviously we all know, environment, social, and governance. It's beyond that. And also to some extent, it's beyond SDGs and sustainability. Where and why? Basically, sustainability means sustaining, just keep sustaining. But a lot of school of thought in the modern, in the recent years, the progressive people started to think, is it really enough to sustain? Don't we need to generate more, make more impact than just sustaining where we are? The world, the environment is not tolerant enough to just keep it as a state. So with that, the concepts of circular economies comes in, regenerative economy comes in, and also there's a lot of CSR type of activities of the corporate. Is it enough? The creating of the shared value, basically, there's so many other terms and buzzwords these days to talk about this, but basically this is more making the actual core value or the core business model of the program, of the company to be moving towards impact, not enough to do it as add-on CSR. So with this, where I would like to think, and I would hope to discuss in the next hour with everybody, is this role of corporates and startups, and why do we measure? How do we measure part? And there are so many ways to do this, and there's no one, in my view, there's no one silver bullet that works for all companies and all sectors and all phase of the company. But here are some ideas that I'd like to discuss. One is obviously the topic of today, the impact-weighted accounting. And the second one is the B Corp certification. This one is the one that I've started to work in the last couple of years, and it's been, I think it's another angle for this topic. So that's B Corp certifications, and obviously there's many international guidelines on ESGs and operational guide for ESG investments. If I may, just quickly on the B Corp, in case this is the first time that people hear, and I'm not only advocates of B Corp, I just think this is a great one new angle. B Corp, it's a certification. Initially started from the US about 15 years ago. And right now, there are about 7,500 companies certified in the world as a B Corp. In Japan, it's really the movement have just started. And as of today, we have about 70. We have about 40. It's a pipeline of another 30. So hopefully 70 this year, but right now about 40 companies. And what are these companies mean that they have got the B Corp certification? B Corp certification consists of the 5 areas: employee, environment, community, governance, and customers. And there's about the questionnaires and activities that they do the due diligence on these 5 areas. And these 5 areas, why it matters is because no company can make anything positive without the consideration of happy employees, happy community, and the good governance, environment, and customers. So these are the whole ecosystem that surrounds the company that's to prove that it's doing good. And there's consist about the 200 questions. You have to get minimum 80 points in order to be considered. And so that's how basically the B Corp works. I'll just stop here because I think we want to discuss with other people. But the last thing that I just wanted to mention here is that the measurements with objectives. So it's important to measure, as Maddie said, but why? What's the purpose of the measurement? Where are we going? So I think that's where I'd love to discuss it, hopefully in the next hour. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nozomi-san. It's great insights that we have to gain from you. And also it gives us a good understanding of the various frameworks that investors, consumers, and companies, as well as other non-equity bearing stakeholders hold on evaluating the impacts of a company. So with that as a frame of reference, I'd also now like to introduce Mr. Carlos Solano, who is going to share more with us about his work at the International Foundation for Valuing Impacts. Let me just briefly introduce you, Carlos, if I bring back up my slides. Are you all able to see my screen?
Yes.
Great. All right. So Carlos Solano is the Market Development Manager at the International Foundation for Valuing Impacts. With an MBA and Professional Science Masters from Rice University, he has a technical background in physics and nanotechnology. Carlos was part of the initial cohorts to take the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board exam and has experience managing and creating reporting standards across industries with initiatives such as the Global Reporting Initiative, the UN SDGs, and the Climate Disclosure Project, amongst others. I know there's a lot more that goes into your bio, Carlos, that is not here. So please, if you would share with us a bit more about your experience, the floor is all yours.
Maddie and Sarah, thank you so much. And Nozomi, it's great to learn about your background. That is very kind. Thank you for the introduction and the invitation. I'm going to share my screen to aid some of the points that I will like to get across. Please let me know if you're able to see my screen. Okay, great. And I'm sorry, I'll be looking at my bigger screen just for a little bit easier to read. My background to IFBI, the International Foundation for Valuing Impacts, it was really nested, or the proof of concept. I'm sorry, I'm also coming out of a bit of a cold, so my apologies. At the Harvard Business School, it was where really the proof of concept was incubated, and it was proved that it's useful for making decisions, for making investments. And at IFBI, the difference is beyond a more academic exercise. We wanted a international body, independent body, to oversee what were some of the steps and the decisions being made towards impact accounting, and having that almost standard body creation type of model without being necessarily a standard setter. So that's what differentiates the work at Harvard versus IFBI. So we have the mission of building and scaling the practice of impact accounting to promote decision-making based on risk, return, and impact. Just to outline the problem, as you're probably all familiar, I will not go through, I'm not going to read every bullet here, but if you're a consultant, an investment, or if you're in an investment team, you know that it is not easy to compare, especially when you have reports from companies across sectors and across regions. It's sometimes hard to make one-to-one decisions. So we believe that the solution is to have some of this ESG metrics, if you will, as inputs and turning that into currency and having those social and environmental metrics really in dollar figures or currency figures. And I think that is easier to compare across industries, across sectors, and really aid decision making. Feel free to stop me as well. A bit of background on IFBI. We have really two main mandates. There is the bigger part of the organization that is really focused on research. So reading the latest papers from around the world from academics, finding the best tools to assess models of models, so very large data sets, to arrive at an impact pathway, meaning what is it beyond inputs into a company, such as providing work and kind of internal solutions inside the company to outputs, but then beyond that, what are the impacts? To get to impacts, we need to know the outcomes, such as we're emitting this much carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide equivalent. That translates into higher sea levels, unpredictable weather patterns. So those are some of the outcomes beyond the outputs of a company. So we take large data sets from governments, from other institutions, and try to arrive at a valuation, if you will, to convert those emissions into a dollar figure. That's within the context of environmental. The methodology oversight, I mentioned briefly earlier the distinction between the work at Harvard and the work at IFBI. It looks like a bit of a messy graph, but really what's going on here is that there's an independent body, fully independent, with experts from academia, from investors, from corporations, from standard setters from around the world. So regulatory bodies like the SEC and others. They really provide the input and they have the decision-making power to inform and approve specific pieces of research and methodology. Separate from the BTPC, let's just call it the technical committee, we have a board of directors of about 26 experts. You may recognize some faces. They're academics and business leaders from around the world. This is a very much a summarized presentation from a larger deck. Here are just a few of the logos that you may recognize who are doing impact accounting, either from the Harvard team or from our partners at the VBA, the Value Balancing Alliance, who is based in Germany. And I don't have it on presentation mode, but it's a bit of a busy slide, I understand. But really the distinction between the left and the right on this slide is trying to make a point that there is impact accounts versus impact information. The analogy here is making reference to financial accounts versus financial analysis, or to some extent, managerial accounting. So financial accounting, managerial accounting, two different sets of tools, if you will. We're working on one side to try to produce those statements, to try to produce this information, whereas tools like B Labs and other, from platforms to processes to regulation, are really the analysis on top and the tools and the resources to try to use the information that is coming out of these statements. That is one useful analogy, although we do make inroads in my team, in the market development team, to try to assess what is needed, what are the tools, what are the complementary resources that could be helpful beyond creating impact accounts. Just to go a little bit deeper on the example that I was going through earlier, here within the context of the environmental pillar, we can think of an input as raw materials or natural gas or labor by employees. The output, there's some activity, there are some impact drivers within a company, but then the output resulting in outcomes and eventually on a cost on human health, cost of crop losses, cost of economic disruption. These are the types of things that we are promoting to be disaggregated so that we don't just all sum up all the risk into a single value, but really try to break down and understand the nuance behind some of the numbers. I'll skip this slide, but it will be very helpful for things like a materiality study, where we also try to make a point of differentiating between upstream own operations and downstream, and really try to keep each line item separate. If people are interested in engaging with the IFBI, we do have capacity. We're not set up as a consultancy, so we don't necessarily compete in that space to try to have clients per se. We're really creating a public good. We're not the only ones doing impact accounting, but we're the only ones doing it as a public good. So it's really accessible to anybody, and we're really just trying to make these solutions. So feel free to reach out. The email is there. Right now, this is a really important one. We have two topical methodologies, as we call them. We have our social pillar and our environmental pillar that are right now have exposure drafts, meaning they're out for public comments. So if you are interested, if this is going to be shared, or if you follow us on LinkedIn, the link is here too. We encourage anybody that is interested to please go in and really provide your thoughts, your feedback. As soon as we are getting letters submitted, we'll be publishing those so that maybe you could see the context or what others have submitted. So we're really hoping to get regional context also from different market players, so investors, corporates, regulators, academics, of course. So please do make an effort to engage with us. That is all I have. Wanted to keep it short and simple, but more than happy to answer any questions. I know I went by a little bit quick.
Thank you, Carlos. That's very helpful. Okay, I have a question that's come up for really both of you, I think. So feel free either one to jump in, or maybe we can hear from you both. For those who are listening in on this and a part of companies that want to measure and to quantify better their impacts, but are not quite sure where to begin, what is their entryway, right? And you both talked about different frameworks, different strategies and methodologies for deciding how to communicate their impact to the public, to their various stakeholders. So Nozomi, could you talk a little bit more maybe about why they would choose the B Corp model and what to do with that? And then maybe Carlos also share, how does a company get into impact-weighted accounts?
Right. Okay. Thank you so much. So I think, again, the question is really valid. And I think a lot of companies, whether startups or the large companies, struggle with that. So where do we start? I know it's important, but where do we start? And I think it's great that, we have also Carlos to talk about more on the impact-weighted accounting too, because I think it really matters on why. Who is the target audience for measuring? Is it to access the finance, or is it to gain more customers and brand recognitions in the market? And I think that makes some decisions a little bit more clear, because there's no one size fits all, and a lot of companies, I'm sure there's a limited resource to just spends on the impact measurement. You want to make the business so that you can make the impact. So on that, I'll talk a little bit more on this B Corp stuff, as Maddie mentioned, which is more targeted toward not just to get the access to finance, but more the brand recognitions, customer acquisitions, and more showing off the message to the world that you're B Corp certified, which may or may not be directly linked with accessing of the finance, especially depends on where the country is from. If it's US or Europe, there's a little bit more stronger connections between the finance, basically the awareness of the fund providers, VC, the banks on the B Corp, but in the Asia context, it's less so. So I'll talk on that part. I think for the B Corp part, again, the objective is to make the company good, whether you get finance or what. For the companies to start with the B Corp, maybe the first step is to talk to me and I can contact with the people. But there's a lot of websites. If you can just search up on the B Lab, B community. Again, there's 7,000 companies in the world. So there are companies that's already existed that's doing this. And it has a list of the minimum criteria that you need to measure in these 5 areas that mentioned earlier: employee environment, community, governance, customers, and what value you're making. If you answer those questions, and I recently just did this, the first business school course on this last week with Waseda Business School, practicing using this B Corp criteria for the companies that are currently not, to use to improve. By answering these questions, by looking at these questions, I think it becomes really clear what are the current gaps that you need to fill. For example, in the environmental sections, there's a questions about what is the CO2 emissions of your company? First of all, is your company measuring those CO2? If so, where are the record, where are the evidence, and where are the proof of it? And if it's not, what are the systems that you're having in place to put the system in place to measure the CO2? And the other thing is, if the CO2 has been measured, has it been going up or down? And what are the measures what are the methodologies that you're using to improve those figures? Same goes for the D and I, about the women, about the disabilities, about the inclusions, etc., etc. So by having these questions, answering them, you already become, you know what your action steps are. And the final outcome is, of course, to, apply for the B Corp and get certified, but also the business impact reports that you can produce. A lot of companies starting to produce a business impact report, which is also useful to get fundings, but also for the customers and the audience and your stakeholders and shareholders. So this business impact report, in order to make the quality business impact report, which comes with both quantified but also qualified, again, this comprehensive measurement of the B Corp could be really useful. So I'll just stop here. Hope that answered the first half of the part.
Thank you.
I couldn't agree more. I think it's hard to emphasize the intentionality of why you're doing this. And I think that will unlock resources for whoever is tasked to do this. So that's a very important point. So we are not creating this in a vacuum. We have an international technical committee, and we inherited everything that was done at Harvard. So we do have a big body of work that you could reference. It's available on our website. And we also have a section in the methodologies that are specifically called data requirements. So you could plug from there. But even beyond that, before you do that, if you're already meeting things like SASB, GRI, ESRS, if you're following the developments in Europe or the US for that matter, from the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is the financial regulatory body, you'll find that you actually have a lot of the data. And we leverage the work of others in the ecosystem, such as Social Value International, the impact management platform. We do have a strong partnership with the GSG, the Global Steering Group on Impact Investing, and others. So we do reference each other's work. And if you are meeting some of the other data reporting criteria, it's very likely that you already have a lot of data to essentially plug in, if you will, to the methodologies that we are continuing to develop.
Thank you. Thank you for answering that. I have another question that has come up and is, I think, in some sense related to this idea of, first of all, why are we measuring what we're measuring? And then that moving to what and how are we measuring it? And this is in terms of extending this idea of quantifying or even monetizing impacts beyond just environmental impacts, so beyond carbon emissions largely, to things like the impact of a product or the impact of various employment practices and so forth, right? Until now, in many conversation circles around quantifying and measuring impacts, carbon emissions has largely dominated those conversations in terms of how we achieve net zero and so forth. And I think you mentioned this, Nozomi-san, in your earlier slide, that there's so much more, of course, to that, and impact-weighted accounts tries to capture that as well. What is the key driver to expanding this conversation beyond just the environmental impacts, like the E in ESG, to other types of impacts that companies have, which are very hard to measure?
Okay, so maybe I'll try to start, and maybe, Carlos and maybe Sarah also have some views on this too. But I think, yes, like a lot of emphasis is put on E, and that's fair enough, because it is, it's critical, and it's one of the things that I think to some extent the E is where the whole movement have started more than like 10, 15 years ago, about more awareness towards environment, and therefore green bonds, green funds, green this, green X basically. But I think that's clearly is not, that's part of it. But the whole idea of, I believe, what we call it as like a purpose-driven company or the purpose-driven economy, it's more towards, it's not only just for the consideration of E, but it's more towards, again, that's where I mentioned in my earlier slide, it's the whole bigger goal of regenerative economy, the impact economy, which is not only on E, but it's also on the people. And because where that comes from, in my understanding, or my own thoughts, is in order for E part to get accomplished, you need people to make that happen. And in order for the people to make that happen, you need finance to support that. In order for the finance to support that, you need to have a company's value to be aligned with the social, the better social, the social goal. And so therefore, they are all interlinked with each other. Without other part, just having the few numbers or the few graphs going upwards on E, it's just not sustainable. That's not the concepts of the sustainability or even the regenerative impact economy. So it goes hand in hand. And there's a lot of studies and a lot of the progressive CEOs of the large companies starting to see that basically, if just to focus on the E, that's a little bit similar. I'm not criticizing, but I'm just using it as a one model that I do think is a limitation, which is more like a CSR concept. The company itself is doing something else, but you just do a little bit of the good stuff to make the case. But again, that's just the add-on. And in reality, like a lot of sustainability departments of many corporate, they struggle because it's come to the reality of how do you get the resource? How do you get the finance? And a lot of companies, they do put the environmental CSR as the top of the web page, as if like we are doing good. But in reality, that team is running by 3 people and really struggling to get the resource. And that's the reality. So again, what's important at the senior level to the bottom level, that add on CSR or add on special team just to make the company look good, that is not sustainable as a business and also for the world. So I strongly think that, it's all interlinked with together. And the more you integrate into the one strategy, it's good for the company and it's good for everybody.
What a great reflection. If we don't have business, we don't have people working in those businesses aligned to conserving our resources. I love that. I do have a couple of extra slides after the presentation, so I'm going to share my screen to make this point. And yeah, the imbalance between, can you guys see my screen?
Yes, it's great.
Okay, excellent. We are very keen on leaning on both the social pillar and the environmental pillar, so that there's no real or perceived conflict between how important both of those are. and taking everything that Nozomi already mentioned, those go hand in hand. Sometimes like the cost of carbon, which can be thought of as environmental, really has a lot of social cost behind it. And it's called the social cost of carbon. So I just wanted to make that point. Here are just a few examples from different types of stakeholders. There's an investor, Summa Equity is a private equity investor based in Europe. Miralex is a company that produces salmon products, so fish, things like fish oil, protein, and others. And what was done in this example is really looking at different impact categories. For example, underserved, providing more access, being more competitive, and giving access to these products, reach or annual volume of sales in different regions, providing basic nutrition needs, health and safety, effectiveness. So these are a few of the numbers that are available on our website that you can find under both, actually under all three, under the Impact Weighted Accounts Initiative at Harvard, under IFEI, and under the VBA. There are case studies that you can reference. Another case study is from Japan, a pharmaceutical company, where it was studied the impact of bringing a specific product to market and how the health impacts and avoided health costs really impact the economy. The links are there. If this presentation is shared, you can study those. And a completely different case study in a different region. This is an EDC, Economic Development Corporation, so sometimes called PPPs. It's a public-private partnership. Fresno is a county in California, and they're using impact-weighted accounts or impact accounting to really make decisions and align the corporations that want to open its doors in the region to align to community impacts or the outcomes that they want to see. So there are a few bullet points here. Again, happy to share this with those that are with anybody that's interested. So we do see that a lot of this is not necessarily on the E, that there's a balance of uses, products that affect people and counties that are looking to improve the community. So I hope that's helpful.
Absolutely. It's definitely helpful to see an example like the one that you brought up, even just to get the listeners' minds, those who are tuning in, going and wondering how they can maybe apply this to their own contexts as well. I may have a few more questions myself, but before I ask those, I want to ask Sarah, do you have questions that have come up?
I have a question about impact accounting as a career. Okay, so for financial accounting, the clear, there is a clear career path. Like you study maybe accounting, like economics, and then there are like certification programs, and then you join accounting firms or you study your own accounting firm, and so it's kind of really clear path. Whereas impact accounting, and when I say impact accounting here, I mean like including ESG, B Corp, impact weighted accounts, all different types of impact measurement and management. And so if like you're in front of young people and they all want to become impact accountants, or like they want to get into impact accounting as a full-time job, like what do you advise them? Like what should they study? What kind of programs they should go through, and what kind of job prospects do they have in different sectors?
Carlos? The first thing I would say is please do. We need more people like that in the world. We definitely more specialized professional people in that field. I think in the current reality, Carlos, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's there's not that many people just focusing their career on impact accounting. It's usually the accountants who do a little bit on the side of the impact, but that's like 20% of his or her portfolio. or the social person learning a little bit of the accounting, went to the accounting schools and doing the accounting, vice versa. But there's not that many mainstream career as focusing on that. We definitely need more those of in Japan, Singapore, I know for sure, but anywhere around the world. So please go. But where do you start? I actually don't know. Carlos?
Yeah, I definitely think that it's a little bit easier to some extent today. It might be harder to some extent competition, but I think it's a big field and that many niches. And you could do things like just learning about the space in general. So if you already have a finance background or accounting background, you could look into GRI or SASB, or I think even the FASB, the Financial Accounting Standards Board in the US, is coming up with some materials if you want to make that transition. And there are even MBA courses now on sustainability, not just courses, but full credentials and um, full programs. So I would look into those. I think Waseda has experience with this. Fresno County, so Fresno State, I believe is the name of the university. So there are quite a few. I would find a program if you're not in that stage of your career to take a full program, you could definitely knock the door within your company and be a so-called entrepreneur. I would very much find a friend in the accounting department, nonetheless, because they're very strict. They have to comply with regulations, so they're very strict about their deadlines. They're very organized with the things that they track. So I would try to make it easier for them to not have, okay, here's somebody asking me to track 100 new things and they're kind of nebulous. No, we want to get down to what is needed, why do I need it, and when do I collect it, and when do I report on it. So just having those things clear and just get engaged, just comment. When I was early in my career, I would just reach out to people, and 3 out of 5 will contact me back. Some of them will politely say, I'm sorry, I'm busy. But a handful became mentors or really gave me more resources. I believe this community is very open. We're very willing to point you to the right direction or to the right person. And I will encourage anybody to do more of that. And yes, we do need more.
Yeah, yeah. I don't know if that, Sarah, the question is come from like any specific people or the person, or depending on the country too. But I do think, just one step back as a whole industry, it's relatively new. It's not like some other occupations that lasted for like 50 years. So there is no like authority to some extent. And so therefore it is a blue ocean. If the new generations dive into this, that's definitely going to be a gem needed in the next 50 years to the 100 years, hopefully. So I do practically think that, I went to the business school in Singapore and there were some accounting course. And I did ask the accounting professor about this impact accounting. So I've learned the basics on the accountings, but there's not that much emphasis on the impact. So I asked the professor, if I wanted to if I want to learn more on this impact accounting, where are the sources? What are the books? What are the professors? Who should I reach out to? And he did mention few names, but he did mention that it's really, usually, at least in Singapore, there's one or two. In US, there's a few prestige, but not that large of the community. So I do think that practically the way to go is just read those, impact accounting books or what's not, and access the author and see, introduce me to your guru, and that's how it gets. And as Carlos said, there's no harm in asking, and I think you'd be more than welcome to, in that field. So if I was 20, 30 years younger, that's what I would do.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you. And if you have any links or any resources, then we can add it to like our event page, and our listeners can take a look and go through those resources as well. So maybe after this, you can share the links. Thank you so much.
Okay, I myself have one last question. We have a few more minutes, unless any other questions come in from the listeners. You both mentioned just now on data and this idea of data input. So any company that's going to be doing this type of accounting or even evaluating where they might fit within the B Corp framework has to have a certain amount of data to work with. And sometimes not all of that could be used in such calculation is available to them. So for the listener who is a part of such organization and really
Hi, my
forward
name is
thinking
Sarah,
on how to get
and I'm the founder of Socious.
their accounting department or their team working towards either impact weighted accounting or even just another methodology for measuring their impacts, could you throw out some types of data, some examples of what they should be tracking and measuring, or what they need really to do this type of calculation?
Yeah, I'll take a first pass on on this one. Again, I will welcome just a quick plugging in for the methodologies. The data requirements are there, but I'll give a few examples on, let's say, the easier one, if you will, as was mentioned earlier, greenhouse gases. So we leverage the work at the IPCC and all the methodology, or all the process that's already there. So converting different types of gases into carbon dioxide equivalents, and so managing those. So whether you have a large Excel sheet tracking people's distance from their job, or if you have boilers or equipment that emit on site, your bills from your rent or the buildings that you manage. So all of those things are relatively easy to find nowadays. Where it gets a little bit more, it's a little bit more involved. It is things on the social end. So for example, tracking wages. This may not be data readily available for everybody. And what is an adequate wage? So in our methodology, we provide criteria for a threshold of what are some minimum requirements to access or to find minimum benchmarks or adequate wages. And we provide some names of resources that we believe are credible and good to use. But internally within the own organization, this data may be a little bit harder to come by. So you may need to make alliances. You definitely need to collaborate across teams. The data sources are not always in the same place, or they're not always that clean, or they're not always updated on time. So you really want to make friends across the organization, depending on, I don't know what industry this will be for, but depending on your sector, there are best practices that you may be able to find. And there are cohorts of people that can help you run this analysis. I would say, yeah, diversity numbers is very context specific. Wages, those are some of the things on the new methodology. But yeah, definitely make friends across the organization to track a few more data points.
Yeah, thanks, Carlos. I'll just add to the great point that you mentioned. I think it's also depends, that this hurdle, like how difficult this is, it really depends on whether the startups, like a single domain companies, startups, or like a multi-domain corporate, like a large corporate with, the sister brother companies across mergers and acquisitions, and also that oversee offices. It really varies on that. Just to give like one quick example, as my company, sorry, I didn't really introduce my company, but the Japan Research Institute, we're a think and do tank based in Japan. But so as we are, I think I can say this publicly, that advocating, supporting the movement of B Corp, like we are sharing with our CEO that since we're going to recommend certain things to other people, don't we need to get to know it further? Because don't we need to do it on ourselves? So we are actually applying for the B Corp right now. And, through this process, as mentioned, this like 200 criteria of the questions that we are doing it internally. And we spent the last like a summer boot camp, almost like 1 month struggling to answer these 200 questions in these 5 areas. And as Carlos mentioned, it's really, it's a little bit different. For example, if this was like my previous impact fund in Singapore, basically the staff of 15, I pretty much knew what we track and what we don't track and what do we need to do. It's all in our head and in that one space shared office. But in the current company, employee of the 4,000, it's not that simple. To get that figures from the environment, we need to ask KA kind of like what is it called? Operational management department. And when we need to get the certain figures on wages and the income gap between the new, which is one indicator, the new entry 22 and the CEO, like what are the income gaps in between, and that should be quantified. And that data only comes from the HR. So when we are answering these 200 questions, we realize that we actually have to deal with all the entire company's department heads, everything, operations to finance to HR to this and that. So I think it can become a difficult task, but I think the Maddie's your questions, the essence is not only how do we get or where do we get, but also like why do we get? And I think that, having this data tracking, it's maybe some people love it. I hate it, but I think it's really, really, really important to keep tracking. So not just the goal is not just a matter of tracking, but so that you improve. Like where do we start? Where do we go from? And coming up with a KPI, you can't make the KPI without the actual data. So I think it's very important. And the environment to some extent is a little bit easier, as Carlos mentioned. Well, not easier, but it's quantifiable. I think that some of the hard one is like a customer satisfactions, the employee satisfactions. Those are the little bit more nuanced ones. But I think for the companies to be competitive, the more you have this data, it becomes your power, because then you know where to improve to. So I can't emphasize how important and how that will strengthen the company.
I have a quick point. I agree with Nosumi. Those are great points. A bit of context or going back in history a little bit. Accounting has gone for a couple 100 years, and it has improved to the level that we are today. However, it's not meeting the needs of, as we're seeing a breakdown on many or failures on many points, or we're hitting limits on every corner. So some of this prompted the creation, at least in the US context around the 30s, of some regulation. We should report if it's going to be available for the public to invest, we should have some minimum standards. And that prompted the creation of the Securities and Exchange Commission. In the 60s and 70s, the first lawsuits to the SEC requiring it or asking it to request some social and environmental metrics in financial accounts. The argument there that was shut down was because it was less than 1% of all investments. So it didn't deem requiring such reporting useful. So this fight has gone on for a while. Right now, actually about 50 years ago in the 70s, over 90% of the S&P 500's market value was in tangibles. So things that you can see and touch, cars, buildings, computers. Now it's the reverse. About 90% is intangibles. So if you're into this work, I think we're finding almost like a flashlight into all of this 90% of value. Where is it coming from? What are intangibles? So things like brand value, IP, intellectual property, all these items, there's a lot of value behind them. And I think impact accounting, B Corps, a lot of this this work is really the evolution of accounting to a certain extent to meet societal needs, not just profit maximization needs. So I just always try to come back to this. I hope that's that's grounding.
It's definitely grounding. One of the things that stands out to me is I listen to both of you, and there are several threads we could pick up from this. But one is just how cross-disciplinary and in some sense holistic this exercise is, right? Nozomi, you were talking about bringing the department heads together to talk about this, and same in terms of a timeline, just looking back at history, Carlos, and understanding where we sit in our context. So really there's an appropriate, if you will, there's an appropriate correlation between how holistic and sort of cross-disciplinary this exercise is with the magnitude of the goal that it's trying to achieve. Well, I am noticing that we are coming to our hour. Are there any final comments from anyone? Carlos, Nozomi, Sarah?
Oh,
Just a big thank you. The more we spread the word, the more we can help.
Absolutely. We appreciate it very much at Socious as well. It's been really fruitful to have both of you share your insights and continue this conversation series. Thank you to everyone who has tuned in. You can find this on X, on YouTube, and we look forward to seeing you in our next conversation when that happens. Thank you, Carlos. Thank you, Nozomi.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much.
for the best.
Cheers.